So we're going to be talking about birth control and abortion in the late 19th century. I will not talk in detail about the techniques that they used or their effectiveness or safety. I am not that kind of a doctor. Just be satisfied with their effectiveness was much lower, their safety was much lower than the kinds of techniques we use today, or at least the versions of some of the same techniques we use today. So what's the background to this? We talked about this with early America, that it was a system that was based on primarily female knowledge, women who learned from other women who often depended on midwives particularly, but increasingly drew on books that began to be published with information and advertising of various commercial products in the mail. The traditional belief had always been that pregnancy really begins at quickening. Quickening is when a woman can feel her baby moving. And the traditional belief is that's when life begins, when the soul enters the body. Not conception. And that, of course, was a thing that only the woman herself could identify, so she was the only one who could know when she was really pregnant. The belief was that before that, it was a stoppage of your menstruation, a stoppage of your menses, and that could be because you were ill, or it could be because you're becoming pregnant. Either way. And you might do various things to restart your menses, which we today might describe as abortion, but they didn't see it like that. They saw it as restarting an ill-healthful condition. We do know that birth rates were declining. Women were having fewer children, so probably they were using abortion and birth control more often. So how do doctors fit into all of this? You have to realize in the 19th century, the idea was that people should have freedom and free choice. And one of the things they should have free choice in was their medical advisor. And so most of the states basically removed the restrictions on medical training, on who could be qualified and call the doctor, and just sort of left it open to the marketplace. So you could declare yourself a doctor. And a lot of people did. Now, that might mean that you had trained in an apprenticeship. That might mean that you had attended a medical school, which were usually short, about a year or so, and involved you listening to lectures, usually, possibly a demonstration or two. Or it might mean that you belong to some alternative form of healing. There were a lot of them, alternative systems. And it also means that there were a lot of other healers out there, such as midwives, who played a particularly important role in childbirth. In childbirth, doctors had a pretty limited role historically. Women went to doctors when birth went wrong, and the thing that they had to offer was they had the instruments that were needed if the child was stuck and couldn't be delivered. They had the instruments that were needed basically to take the baby apart and get her out of the mother's body so the mother could survive. Otherwise, doctors were usually not seen as necessary for the process of childbirth. As late as 1860, only about 10 to 20% of women would go to a doctor to give birth. However, starting in the late 18th century and moving forward, doctors increasingly began to argue that they were more skilled than midwives, that midwives weren't properly trained, that they were the ones who should actually be doing childbirth, and midwives were just a bunch of old women moored in superstition. Now, this at the time period where they're saying this in the early 19th century, it's pretty much a joke. A doctor who went to medical school may never have seen a woman given birth. Doctors were not supposed to look at their patients' private parts early on. And so we have here a man examining his pregnant patient. Their big claims to improvement, the things that they can say that midwives don't have, is first of all forceps, which were a tool that had been designed actually sometime earlier, but it was originally kept secret as a special form of equipment, which was forceps, which you can use to grasp the child's head and pull them out, and actually risk some damage, but still. And chloroform, which they used to basically sedate and relieve pain of the woman who was giving birth. And that second thing was seen as a great improvement for many women who were attracted to the idea of having a painless birth. Doctors may claim that they were more scientific, that they were more modern, that they were safer, and things like that, but the reality is, even though a growing number of parents chose to go to doctors rather than midwives, until the 1930s, if you look at the statistics, you were safer giving birth at home with a midwife, usually, than you were going to a hospital with a physician. Physicians became pretty aggressive in their attacks on childbirth and midwives, and particularly on the use of abortion. One critical point there is they redefined the concept of conception, when life begins. And this is because they're drawing on new knowledge about fetal development and embryology that comes from scientists, physicians doing medical research to actually examine the process of development. And what they discover is there's no hard, fast dividing line there. There isn't something visibly different about the stage of quickening. Instead, what they see is as a process of development from beginning to end that's just constant. And so they begin to argue that conception is actually when life begins. And therefore, any attempt to end the pregnancy starting at conception is abortion and is an immoral act. That's at least the official statement. That's what the American Association of Medicine says. That's what a lot of the new profession of obstetrics says, and gynecology. In practice, a lot of doctors continue to provide abortions, and we're not influenced necessarily by this, but that's at least the official physician line. And as a result, they attack healers who provide abortions. They particularly target women doctors, like Dr. Mary Walker, who's in the picture. They accuse alternative types of doctors. And finally, they put a lot of their venom towards midwives. And they claim that they are abortion providers, that they are corrupt, that they are bad healers, and cannot be trusted. They also attack women who use abortion. And there's a lot of hostility there as well. The idea is that women who get abortions were seen as being two types. The ones who it's not really their fault because it's single women who the belief is they were tricked into having sex by a man who promised marriage or various things like that, or a minister who had too much influence over her. And she was tricked into having sex, and as a result, she became pregnant, and then her seducer would drive her to, encourage her to or force her to use abortion. So that really wasn't her fault, and it was sort of just another emblem of how society was dangerous for women, that they could be out of their place and wandering in society and be abused and driven to this. The other group, though, that they see as committing abortions are middle-class married women, particularly. And they see these women as getting abortions basically for convenience. They don't want to bother with a child. They're not being truly womanly. They're not being committed to their duty to raise children and care for their homes. They just want to go and engage in fashion and shopping and things like that. So basically, they're getting an abortion out of convenience, is what they accuse them of. And they see this as a betrayal of their womanly nature and their husbands and the children. But they also see this as a betrayal of the race. And so these are white, well-off men who are usually making these attacks. And they argue that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant women, middle-class women, need to have more children, elite women too. And they need to have more children because there's a competition going on between women like them and poor and immigrant women. And if poor and immigrant women are allowed to have too many children, they'll outpopulate the good women of the middle and upper classes, and that'll be a disaster for the white Protestant race. And then finally, a lot of this is just attacks in general of women who are seen as being out of place gets included. Women who do the things that women should not do, like becoming doctors, but also women who go to college, which their various doctors claimed would cause them to have all kinds of health problems. Women who became reformers, women who tried to tell men what to do, women who were arguing that men should not drink, all of those kinds of groups, they basically see as women out of their place, which of course is at home, caring for their children, caring for their husbands. One of the great ironies about all of this is that, in fact, women who were reformers, for the most part, were actually opponents of abortion and contraception themselves. They believed in something called voluntary motherhood. And so women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who are looking here, who are women's rights activists, argued that, in fact, what mattered was voluntary motherhood, that women should have the right to say no. And that is both an admirable stance, that women should be able to say no to their husbands and say, no, I don't want to have sex right now. This is a time when it'd be bad for us to conceive a child. But in reality, that was not something women had the power to do in a lot of cases. Second thing is they had a real focus, like a lot of people at this time, on what was going on at the moment of conception. So if your husband is drunk and violent, that badness of him, his drunkenness, his violence, will be reflected in the child who is conceived. Same thing if the mother was drunk or whatever, but it's sort of believed that the passions, the misbehavior, the dangers of the state of the parents at conception will be reflected in the child. So, for example, a drunk husband, a drunk father could lead to a child who would be called an idiot, a child of low competence and intelligence. At the same time, they oppose abortion and contraception because they see these as setting men free to go sin, right? They can use contraception as protection if they're going to visit prostitutes or having affairs or doing various things like that. Women, they believed, would lose their moral standing as mothers if they used technologies like abortion and contraception. What happens is you have a series of laws passed focusing on abortion from between the 1820s and the 1870s, basically. Most of them in the middle of there. And these laws were passed by the states. It was a state issue, which means that it happens state by state. The laws are all slightly different state by state, and they happen at different times. It really depended on when somebody local got upset about the issue and was able to pull together a group and pressure the legislature to get the legislation passed. The bulk of these laws, except for Connecticut's the big exception. In Connecticut, it was illegal to have an abortion. All the other states, it's illegal to give someone an abortion. So the laws actually target abortion providers rather than the person who is the recipient. Some of them specifically refer to quickening as a mark, so they make it a crime after quickening. So that shows that idea was still hanging on for a lot of people. When an abortion came to light, generally it's because somebody died. as a result of the abortion. And the thing is that even though women were not punished specifically for having an abortion, they were punished in effect. Because what happens is there will be questioning. They will go and talk to every family member, her friends, everyone, her if she's dying, so she's not dead yet. Because what they want to get from her is they want to have her give a deathbed confession saying, so-and-so got me pregnant and so-and-so administered the abortion. Giving that information so it could be submitted in court as a way of proving who was the person at fault. A deathbed statement, so even though it would be hearsay, it would be treated as fair to introduce into court, because the idea is that once you're dying, you're only going to tell the truth because you're facing your God. What she had done is going to be made incredibly public. Her family's going to be made incredibly public. There would be newspaper stories often. If it was seen as a particularly scandalous case, big newspaper stories. If it wasn't seen as a particularly scandalous case, small newspaper stories. But it's going to be made very public. And so we can see this as a way of punishing women who do get abortions by this publicly revealing what happened to them. The other thing about these laws is most of the laws allow abortion to be used to preserve the life and health of the mother. Sometimes it's phrased as therapeutic abortion. So in a sense, a doctor did have the right to perform an abortion under these laws usually. They just had to decide that it was therapeutically necessary. So it shifts the decision from the woman seeking out something or using drugs or whatever to do it to herself to what the physician side decides is acceptable. It becomes an important part of consumer culture. The advertising is pervasive. It's pretty much anywhere, particularly in papers that were seen as attractive to working class people, immigrants, sort of ordinary people. The elite journals and things like that would probably not allow this kind of advertising to appear in them because they regard it as unseemly and inappropriate. And initially, black papers weren't sure whether they should include it because they saw it as sort of undercutting their respectability. But over time, they include more of the contraception advertising. It seems to have been immensely popular. We know that a number of businesses did quite well. These devices and pills were available through mail order, which meant that people living in rural areas could easily get access. You could buy them in pharmacies, you could buy them in local shops. And that meant that people in New York City, Chicago, Denver could get them, but it also meant that a black sharecropper in Mississippi could get access to them. Now, the cost might be a real problem. The thing about it is they were unregulated, which means they might be fine, or your condoms might have holes in them. Your pills might not be what they say they are. There could be various other problems. And there was no regulation, so there was nobody saying, is this safe? Is this effective? Will this do what you want it to do? You just had to try it and see, and maybe ask your friends for recommendations. So there's a big change in 1873. There is a man, Albert Comstock, who is a man who comes from a small town into New York City and becomes convinced that it is a place of vice and degradation and all kinds of horrible things. And he's shocked by the fact that there is obscenity, including advertisements for birth control and abortion everywhere. And he thinks something has to be done about this. So he starts making it a one-man crusade. And he becomes involved with YMCA, Young Man's Christian Association, and then later with a group called the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, which is basically an offshoot of the local YMCA. And in that role, he comes up with this new law that he brings to Congress and manages to get it passed. And it's sort of passed at the last minute. Nobody really remembers why, but it goes through with very little comment. And this law has a series of things, and it basically bans sending obscene literature and obscene items through the public mail. And it covers everything from playing cards with pictures of naked ladies to items of birth control, to books about sex. It's not legal to be sent through the public mails. And of course, this includes devices for birth control and abortion, and the literature advertising those. Now, the other thing about this is that it's going to be, for the most part, private enforcement of a public law. And this happens a lot in issues about social purity campaigns around this time period, because Comstock is going to basically be paid by the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice to go through the public mails, monitor and discover cases of obscenity, and then get together the information necessary to make it a court case. So he's not a public servant in the sense that he's not employed by the government. He's employed by a private organization, but he's doing work that helps the government enforce a law. One other thing worth keeping in mind about Comstock is he was broadly hated by many people and frequently mocked in the newspapers. He was seen as very pompous, and people didn't take him very seriously. But he did have a fair amount of influence. The other thing about it, and you've got this from your reading, is that while he did have a huge impact on some people's lives, particularly in the obscenity prosecutions, he really did not succeed in ending the commerce and birth control and abortion pills and devices. What ends up evolving is that pregnancy and controlling pregnancy stratifies. If you're a member of the middle class or elite, you have easy access. You can go to doctors. Doctors can give you a therapeutic abortion. You can do that in privacy of your own home or of the medical office, possibly of a hospital. It's quite easy to get. My own grandmother in the 1930s, when she had had her second child and got pregnant again, just could not handle the thought of another pregnancy. Her doctor gave her a therapeutic abortion for reasons of mental health. That was a very reasonable, easy thing to do for middle class, like my grandmother. If you were working class or poor, you had fewer options. You had to afford, if you were going to go to someone to help you get that. Your options in terms of going to midwives and things like that were becoming harder because midwives were under a lot of harassment. You had less privacy. You didn't have a private room at home to get this done. You might have to go to a clinic. You might have to actually get someone to allow you to stay with them. You had less safety in what you get and what happens to you. You're quite possibly going to end up with a physician or other healer or midwife who is not trustworthy, does not know what they're doing, is not skilled, does not care about things like sanitation. There is also, however, the easy spread of pills and devices that you can get from Mississippi to Illinois to Oregon to Maine. But once again, those are not regulated. So their safety, their efficacy is, not guaranteed in any way, shape, or form. What are our conclusions here? First of all, there's a lot of popular acceptance of contraception and abortion. Even though there is this Comstock law that tries to argue against it, it's not that effective. People still are able to get it and get these services. Or it is illegal, but it is not unavailable. Regulation is tightly tied to the rise of regular medicine. So the process of doctors becoming the official healers in the United States and getting regulated and protected status, a large chunk of that is tied to their battles against abortion and their battles against midwives. There was a strong critique that some people believed in that abortion and contraception were a threat to women's doing their duty of having children and caring for their families, and their duty to spread the white elite race. There's this tangle of public regulations with private enforcement that, like I said, we see in the case of the Comstock law. And then finally, the end point with abortion is that it ends up at the discretion of doctors. That it is no longer something that a woman judges that she needs, or she may judge that she needs, but now she has to get a doctor to agree with her. And for sources, Mary Fissel's Pushback, Leslie Reagan's When Abortion Was a Crime, Ricky Sollinger's Pregnancy and Power, and Andrea Tone's Devices and Desires.